This episode of RealAg Radio is brought to you by high-performing new Carbine insecticide from FMC. Carbine insecticide delivers fast, selective, and extended control of aphids in alfalfa and pulses, leaving beneficials like lady beetles to help in the fight. Ask your retailer today.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Wednesday midweek edition of the show. Hey, thanks so much for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a part of your workday. And of course, as always, big shout out to everybody also listening out there on the RealAg Radio podcast, no matter where you're farming, Canada, the U.S., or beyond. Today on the program, first I should say, today's show is brought to you by Pride Seeds. Yes, longtime supporter of RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com. So a big shout out to Fred and the entire team at Pride Seeds for being today's show's sponsor. Thank you very much. It's great to have you aboard. Encourage you to go to prideseeds.com. We're going to hear more from Pride Seeds here in a little bit. Carrie Maclean is with us. She's one of their market development agronomists and going to talk about, spring in the air and the weather and getting ready and some of the stuff they're doing with some of their field plot programs and things like that. So looking forward to having her here today on the program. We're also going to talk, speaking of weather, we've got Scott Kehler. He is the president and chief scientist with Weatherlogics. Will be on the show today, providing a little bit of a forecast for the Western Canadian prairies as well as Eastern Canada. It's been a bit of a we've all kind of been on common ground, so to speak, here in the first half of April. Now, this week has been beautiful in Ontario and warming up on the prairies as well. But what happens next? What happens next? Does this cool bias kind of continue as some of this nicer weather short term? And what about precipitation? Of course, that's a big question for many people in places like southwestern Saskatchewan, for sure. So we're looking forward to hearing what Scott has to say as we transition out of La Nina. We're also going to hear from Tyler McCann. He's managing director at CAPI, as well as Kelvin Heppner from RealAgriculture. We have a new episode of the Ag Policy Connection podcast dropping here, and many of you have reached out and said you're really enjoying this deep dive into some of these ag policy topics. We got another one here today, and this is one of the you're going to be like, why is it taking so long to get to this one? It's about basically the Canadian government making the decision 10 and a half years ago, to get rid of the single desk with the Canadian Wheat Board. And not talking specifically about the impacts of that decision, but really honing in on what led to the decision. And Kelvin and Tyler are two strong followers of that topic. So looking forward to hearing from them today on the program. We'll also have some time for the top ag news stories of the day. If you have any feedback on today's program, we would love to hear from you. You can send me, of course, an email at shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find us across all the different social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok as well, or you can call that RealAg feedback line. The number is 855-776-6147. The best way to get a hold of me there is you dial the number, you press the number 3, and you leave me a message. That's right, you leave me a voicemail. I won't even make you come on the air live. No. 855-776-6147. Don't be shy, and let me know what is on your mind. Had a great experience this morning. Got to host a webinar with Grain Fox, and it was fun. It was really, really good. So we had a couple of the market analysts from Grain Fox on there as well. Somebody we've heard on this program, we've been talking to Jacob Shapiro from Cognitive Investments. And really, we hit on there for like a 70-minute webinar. And if you missed it, check out Grain Fox's website. I think they're going to be posting the archive of it, and they're also going to have a report that they're sending out. But we know this, but this intersection of the commodity market complex and then geopolitical issues. And I think in one time, probably, we talked a little bit more of those two things in isolation, right? We would talk about supply and demand of grain, what the trade flows could be, but it was just more from a supply and demand standpoint, and there was sort of a separation from more of the geopolitical stuff. Maybe it's just recency bias on my part, but it just seems right now they're just totally like commingled. You can't talk about one without the other from an agricultural standpoint. So encourage you to, if you did miss that webinar today, I appreciate the people from Grain Fox for inviting me. That was a lot of fun. I'm right in my bailiwick there. Talking markets and some geopolitical stuff. Very, very fun. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get to the weather. We've got Scott Kehler here from Weatherlogics, going to find out what spring means weather-wise. When we come back, you're listening to RealAg Radio, brought to you today by Pride Seeds.
Maximize your yield potential by improving your nutrient use efficiency with WolfTrack's DDP micronutrients from Koch Agronomic Services. WolfTrack's micronutrients allow crops to consistently access the nutrients they need when they need them. And with Even Coat technology, WolfTrack's products thoroughly coat each and every granule, giving you an even distribution and placing micronutrients in close proximity to growing roots. Better nutrition, better crops, better farming. Get started today at wolftraxmicros.ca. That's wolftraxmicros.ca.
How's your seed quality? What should you treat with? What about herbicide carryover and environmental concerns? Spring is here, and you've got a lot of things to think about in regards to your pulse crop. The Pulse School on Real Agriculture has information and advice for all these questions and more to help you navigate this season. Brought to you by BASF. Pulse School episodes are available at pulseschool.com, realagriculture.com, or as a podcast on your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Looking for robust, reliable grain storage solutions? AGI leads the industry in quality, innovation, and offerings to protect your investment. Designed for exceptional cleanout, superior strength, and unbeatable versatility, you can rest easy knowing your grain is secure in an AGI West Steel bin. With 100 years of manufacturing experience, AGI West Steel bins will exceed your expectations for reliable storage. AGI West Steel. Long-term safe storage. Find AGI at your local dealer.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio here on this Wednesday midweek edition of the show. Today's show is brought to you by Pride Seeds. Make sure you go to prideseed.com and check out all their great corn and soybean hybrids. Let's talk about the weather. Spring is upon us, sort of. It's felt very elusive, but it's within our grasp. At least we're starting to see some nicer weather for sure out in Eastern Canada. As I was watching the Blue Jays home opener yesterday, and they were talking about why isn't the roof open, which is crazy talk for a home opener in Toronto, but also a bit of some warmer weather happening on the prairies. We're going to break it all down for you in the spring forecast. We've got Scott Kehler. He is the president and chief scientist with Weatherlogics. Hey, Scott, great to have you.
Nice to join you again.
Absolutely. Okay, let's start on the prairies. Why not? What are you expecting for spring here? Because we've heard a lot about the transition out of La Nina and what that could potentially mean. It's still kind of chilly for the fact it's the middle of April. Like I am in Lethbridge here, and usually we're rolling, planting like crazy, and that hasn't happened yet. Manitoba finally starting to warm up a little bit. What are you expecting here for spring?
Well, spring started out different depending whether you're in the western prairies or the east. In the west, it was a fairly normal start where you had some warm temperatures early on, and it's cooled off a little bit more recently, but that's not too unusual. However, in the east, they had a deep snowpack through a lot of Saskatchewan into Manitoba, also in the northern U.S., and so things have been very slow to get going there. The month of March didn't even reach above freezing in Winnipeg, and now April's turned around completely, and the snow is almost gone in the Winnipeg area in a matter of days. So we're seeing kind of a big shift that way. As we go forward, I think the month will generally end up around normal for most areas, but that normal will be comprised of a lot of high temperatures on some days and much colder temperatures on others. So it'll be very up and down.
Yeah, well, we've been experiencing the up and down here in Alberta because Sunday, gorgeous. People are out golfing, courses are open. It's people are out in their back decks, having a cold one. And today it snowed again. So there's an up and down for you. So do you though expect from an air temperature standpoint, do you expect this kind of cool bias to continue into May, or is it going to be a situation where it's like, boom, it's like, where did spring go? It's already summer.
Well, it looks like the cool bias is going to linger a little bit longer into April than usual because of the deep snowpack. When you have a deep snowpack, that can cut easily 10 or 15 degrees off air temperatures versus what it otherwise might be. In Manitoba, for example, on Tuesday, had there been no snow, it would have been close to 30 degrees already, but the snow held things down into the mid-teens. As we get later into April, that snow will be gone, so that bias will be removed. Now, I don't think that for most areas it's going to be a super dramatic shift to summer. However, it might feel that way in some cases, especially in a place like Alberta. If you go from snow one day to 30 the next day, that might feel very dramatic, but that's not as unusual. In Manitoba, Saskatchewan, they're probably going to go more like from mid-teens to 20s and then maybe to 30 in May.
What about precipitation? We had a much better growing season in 22 compared to 21. That's that's an understatement. But what are we expecting here for the early part of 23 when it comes to precipitation as we transition out of La Niña?
Well, the forecast we issued for the summer earlier this winter calls for a drier than normal growing season in the western prairies and a fairly normal growing season precipitation-wise in the east. However, the west will probably stay drier more generally across the growing season. At least that's our forecast now. Whereas the east, we're expecting to start a little bit wetter in the spring and then become drier as we move later into the summer. So that's a little bit similar to last year, although last year was extremely wet in the spring in the east and then got a little bit drier, or really not dry, but more normal come summertime.
We've got some ranchers in that southwestern corner, southeastern Alberta area that aren't going to like what you just told us, Scott.
I know. I've been hearing a lot of criticism of my forecast in the western prairies. They've been wanting rain for a long time, and the unfortunate thing is you're in a much drier climate to begin with, and then when you don't get rain, that just makes it much worse.
Yeah. Okay. Let's make sure we hit on. Well, actually, before I go forward, I want to ask you one more question about the prairies, and that is heat-wise. You mentioned the precipitation for air temperature for the summertime for the prairies. What are you expecting there?
So that follows a similar trend to precipitation. We're expecting that the western prairies will generally be a warmer growing season, and in the east, a more normal growing season in terms of temperature. But when I say normal, that's really an average of two different pieces of the season. So the spring will probably start cooler, and we've already seen that in the east, and then turn hotter as we get more into the summer. So the hotter summer and the cooler spring will balance out to be close to normal.
Okay, I want to ask you about Eastern Canada. They have also had a bit of a slow start. It's been cool. We had snowstorms and ice storms last week in the eastern part of Ontario. But then, as I mentioned at the beginning, southwestern Ontario experiencing a pretty nice week of weather here. People talking about why the Blue Jays, the Rogers Center wasn't open yesterday. So what can we expect here for the remaining parts of spring as farmers try to hit the field there in Eastern Canada?
Well, Eastern Canada has been off to a fairly strange start to the year. Eastern North America in general has had a very warm winter, but at the same time, they've had a lot of snow and ice at times as well. And now snow and ice threat is probably over, as Eastern Canada doesn't really tend to get winter weather in spring like the prairies does, except in very rare cases. So that's probably out of the way. And now we're seeing a very dramatic change over to mid-20s, especially in southern Ontario again today. It's in the mid-20s. So it looks like for them, conditions are becoming quite favorable. Proceeding now as we get into summertime, when it comes to the east, it's things get very tricky because they have a lot of thunderstorm activity like we do in the prairies. And so the ability to predict precipitation trends there, like in Western Canada, is difficult because of that. We don't make a summer forecast for the East because we're focused on the prairies. So I can't say what we're expecting for the entire growing season there, but do expect that you'll get very variable amounts of precipitation as we get into May and June, with thunderstorm activity picking up. And actually, they've already seen quite a bit of thunderstorm activity in southern Ontario.
Yeah, how about from an air temperature perspective here in the spring, as farmers are looking to wait for that soil to be fit to hit the field at that ideal time? A lot of people talking about soil temperature. It's not the only factor, but that's one of the components here of the soil being fit when we're trying, especially when we're trying to put corn in the ground, because it is quite a sensitive crop in those early stages. So how warm will the spring be as we transition here to May?
Well, it does look like the central part of Eastern Canada, by that I mean more Ontario. Quebec will probably start with a warmer spring, carrying off the relatively warm winter they've had. And we're already seeing those, pretty warm temperatures there. So the fact that they don't tend to have deep frost in Eastern Canada, along with this earlier spring, will probably mean a pretty good start to the growing season for them. Atlantic Canada is a bit cooler to start, but again, they don't have deep frost like the prairies does. So if they get a fairly quick switch to warmer weather a little later this month, things could pick up there pretty quickly as well.
When you look at the overall Canadian geography, what's the weather wild card for this year? I know we don't get consistent weather across the entire country, though it feels like this early spring has been very connected, where it's just been cool everywhere. And kind of unstable. But what's the wild card to watch out for here in 23?
Well, I think the wild card this year, like it is almost every year, is the prevalence of thunderstorms. Whenever you're dealing with a thunderstorm, you're talking about a phenomena that's on the scale of only kilometers in width. And so if you're in an area that gets a series of thunderstorms moving over, you get entire months worth of rain in a matter of days, or even in extreme cases, hours. And so that makes a huge difference, particularly on the prairies where you don't have as much growing season precipitation to start with. If you have a lot of thunderstorm activity, that changes things entirely. And in the past few years, we haven't seen especially active thunderstorm patterns, but now that we're moving into an El Nino, typically El Nino brings more thunderstorm activity, especially in the eastern prairies. And so for farmers there, I'd watch out for that. And then in the east, thunderstorm activity is also important, particularly in southern Ontario and Quebec. And so that similar phenomenon plays out there, although the correlation with El Nino may not be as strong.
My understanding is with La Nino, not great growing conditions for Australia, more positive for the Canadian geography, especially from precipitation standpoint. But the transition from La Nina to La Nino, it's not like it's sort of like one ends and the other one begins, is kind of how I understand it. This transition to the opportunity for more precipitation in the western half of the U.S. and the western Canadian prairies, it's sort of like it's sort of classified. Like we'll know when we need to know. It's not a quick transition. Is that correct? Am I reading that right?
I'd say that's pretty fair to say. The other thing about the transition from one pattern to the other is that it's not something which you can always count on occurring, every month of a growing season or every month when this is in place. So you'll have broad periods of time, let's say seasons or years, where you can sense that El Nino is playing a role, but other factors also come into play as well. El Nino only refers to the temperatures in the central Pacific Ocean, but the northern Pacific Ocean also plays a role in prairie climate. And so if its influence increases or decreases, that can affect our weather as well. So because the central Pacific is a very, very large area, it's one of the more dominant factors that affects us. But remember that even if you're in an El Nino pattern, that doesn't mean that the weather can suddenly change to be a lot less El Nino-like for short periods of time before it goes back into that more prevailing pattern.
What we need is like one of those Colorado lows. Instead of kind of taking that sort of diagonal path where it hits like South Dakota and North Dakota and Manitoba, it'd be nice if it actually hit like East End Saskatchewan. Just sort of divert and go a little bit more vertical. That would really help us out.
Well, the word Colorado low is either a blessing or a curse, depending where you live. If you're in Manitoba, you don't want to hear the word Colorado low ever again, because we had about what was it, 300-400 millimeters of rain in April, May, June last year from them, and people almost didn't get seeded. But if you're in the Western Prairies, you'd love to get them. So as a Manitoba person, I'm happy to send all our Colorado lows out your way.
Montana would thank you too, by the way. Okay. Hey, this has been great, Scott. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a great week.
That is Scott Kehler. He is the president and chief scientist with WeatherLogics. We'll be right back on RealAg Radio, brought to you today by Pride Seed.
How's your farm's financial performance? Know where you stand and take your operation to the next level with FCC Benchmarker. Compare your farm performance against similar-sized operations in your area with FCC Benchmarker, a new tool from Farm Credit Canada. It helps identify your strengths and areas for improvement and empowers you to make strategic business decisions. Ready to start? Contact your local Farm Credit Canada office for details.
As you head out into the field this season, the Corn School's got you covered. Everything from tillage discussions, weed control info, field trial results, yield strategies, and more. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast from your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
If you're thinking about growing oats in 2023, how about trying CDC Endure from Alliance Seed? CDC Endure Oats is consistently one of the top yielding varieties in the Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta provincial yield trials. With strong standability, excellent disease resistance, and excellent end-use quality, CDC Endure might be the variety for you and your farm. Available from authorized Alliance Seed retailers, Parrish and Heimbecker, Patterson Grain, and Northwest Terminal. For more information, visit allianceseed.com.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. It's now time to talk to today's show sponsor, Pride Seeds. And we're joined right now by Pride Seeds market development agronomist in Ontario. It is Carrie Maclean. Carrie, great to have you on the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Shaun. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Spring felt kind of elusive 2 weeks ago, and now all of a sudden, the weather's looking a lot better. I know you've been out and about. Like last week, the Pride Seeds team was out at the Canadian Dairy Expo as one example, and you've done a number of different farm shows through the winter. What's some of the things that you've been hearing from growers as we get a little bit closer to planting time?
Well, you're exactly right. The weather has taken a pretty sharp turn here in southwestern, south central Ontario, and it sounds like across a large swath of the country as well. So people went from their snowsuits to their rain boots to now things are drying up really quickly. We're having a 20-degree day here with heavy winds in south central Ontario, and that is perfect conditions for things drying up. At the Dairy Expo last week, everyone had their weather apps open and looking ahead to the beautiful weather. And out driving around the territory today, I'm noticing a lot of tillage tools hooked up and sitting in front of shops. Manure tankers are sitting out by the barns. I've seen the odd planter kind of sitting in front of the shop as well. So people are really feeling the spring conditions and getting geared up to start some of that spring work.
Yeah, and we kind of wait all winter for this, right? This is kind of the time period. It's funny that it always kind of goes in parallel with sort of baseball. You got to get through the winter, you see spring training, and then it's opening day, and it's, you know, we have lots of anticipation for this time of the year. But having said that, this is also the time of the year we need to focus on that soil being fit. Do not rush.
Exactly. This is the time of year that farmers live for. And so it makes sense that they're all feeling a little extra antsy here in the nice weather conditions. But patience is so important. And farmers know their own ground, know their own soil better than anyone else. But it is something that I do preach. And I grew up on a farm with some real sticky clays, so I'm probably run on the cautious side. but making sure that your soils are fit before you get out there with any heavy equipment is going to be key. So, for example, today, like I said, I was seeing some different tillage tools kind of around the countryside. Right now, I think I'd much prefer farmers to be, boots on the ground. If you really itching to get out of the field, it's the perfect time to be out reassessing your wheat stands, taking a look for some of the weeds that are coming up, assessing how your fall herbicides did, and making tweaks and tinkering with your plans for the year ahead. All that kind of agronomic work is really important, and we've been given a really nice window here to get some of that extra stuff done that can be tough to fit in some years.
Yeah, there's lots of sayings that kind of go here, like, patience is a virtue, or maybe the opposite is sometimes the early bird doesn't get the worm, things like that. I know you also want to talk about some of the plot work that the Pride Seeds agronomy team has, the plans in place for the upcoming season. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So as most folks know, the seed companies were all involved in a lot of trials throughout the growing season, and at Pride, we're no different. We're very excited to have a really wide network of different plots with our hybrids and varieties. We work closely with our dealers and retail networks to get that done so we can see our current commercial hybrids and varieties as well as experimentals in the field under, real farm conditions. So as an agronomist, this is what I look for, is these trials. But in addition to just looking at some of the variety trials, we do a few extra fun things every year to try and really get to know each of our hybrids really well before they make a splash in the marketplace. So one of the big ones that our team is working on, and this is from all across the country, our Pride Agronomy team is working on doing experimentation, looking at populations for both corn and soybeans. How do different populations affect different hybrids and varieties? And that is with grain corn, that is with soybeans, that is with silage corn hybrids as well. And digging into that a little bit deeper, we're looking at ear flex, and that is something the industry has been talking about for years. But we're trying to really kind of level up on that ear flex data this year.
If you want more information about Pride Seeds, today's show sponsor, also a sponsor of our corn and soybean school here at Real Agriculture, go to prideseeds.com, or of course you can also talk to your local retailer. Carrie, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks so much, Shaun.
That is Carrie McLean, Market Development Agronomist with Pride Seeds. We'll be right back on RealAg Radio right after this.
MNP's Farm Management Consulting Team is proud to help farmers and livestock producers remain competitive and profitable. Our team is made up of professional agrologists and consultants who come from extensive agriculture backgrounds themselves and offer a high level of technical expertise, first-hand knowledge, and close relationships within the agriculture industry. Whether you're looking for help with your day-to-day challenges or require specific advice, our customizable service offering means you can call on us for whatever advice you need. Visit us at mnp.ca to learn more.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. Today's show is brought to you by Pride Seeds. Go to prideseed.com and check out their extensive portfolio when it comes to corn and soybeans. And we are right close to planting. And so if you need to, those last minute switch acres, make sure you go to prideseed.com. You check out their great portfolio. Let's talk about the new episode dropping here this week of the Ag Policy Connection podcast, which is presented by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, better known as CAPI, and RealAgriculture. Let's first bring in the host of this podcast. It is Kelvin Heppner of RealAgriculture. Hey, Kelvin, how's it going?
Doing well here, Shaun. Looking forward to this discussion as we had the chance to reminisce about a major story that we focused on, especially in Western Canada, for many decades.
Yeah, one that a young gumshoe egg journalist that I know really cut his teeth on this topic.
It's true. I started in working as a farm broadcaster in the late 2000s, and that was right in the heat of the Canadian Wheat Board debates. And the sides were definitely dug in at that point. And I would say that I learned a few lessons in terms of balancing coverage and handling feedback from the audience and things like that in covering the evolution of the Canadian Wheat Board and ultimately the end of the single desk in 2012, which is what we talk about on this week's episode of the Ag Policy Connection.
Perfect. Also joining us is the Managing Director at CAPI. It is Tyler McCann. Tyler, welcome back.
Thanks, Shaun, for having me. I look forward to this discussion.
Yeah, so I guess, Kelvin, started out by give us an overview. Who were the panelists on this episode, and what exploration path did we go on?
So we have a pair of, I'd say, unique perspectives on the end of the Wheat Board as part of this episode. They are people that we didn't necessarily hear from every day. There were certain personalities that were in the media throughout the end of the Wheat Board, that whole process on both sides, and spokespeople on both sides. And I'd say our guests for this panelist are some of the people that were more behind the scenes. First, we have Aaron Gardner. Aaron was the chief of staff to former federal agriculture minister Jerry Ritz, who, of course, made the call and pushed this file forward. So internally, and Tyler can speak to this further, internally, Aaron actually did a lot of the advancement in terms of the legislation that was brought forward in 2011 following the federal election where the Conservatives won the majority. They brought forward Bill C-18, and Aaron did a lot of the behind-the-scenes work on this file. So he's on our panel for this episode. As well, we have somebody who is well known in Ottawa political circles, but not everyone might realize the connection that he has to the Wheat Board. That is David Hurley, longtime Liberal strategist, pundit. He was a senior advisor for Paul Martin when he was Prime Minister. And for a large number of years, he's also been a pollster, and he used to actually run the Wheat Board's annual producer surveys. So we invited David to join us on this podcast. Of course, he also hosts a couple of very well-known podcasts, the Hurley Burley and Curse of Politics. So it was cool to have his perspective on this episode as well.
Very neat. I remember going back to last summer, which was the 10-year anniversary of this change. Boy, does time ever fly. Real Agri Studies had asked Western Canadian farmers on their perspective of this change, and we asked them which of the following best describes how you feel about the policy change now. And 77% of Western Canadian farmers said to us in that study, it's been better than I expected. Such a popular decision, apparently, based on that piece of data, Tyler, yet this one still seems to carry a lot of emotion and perspective, I guess, that really haven't changed.
You know, and Shaun, it really highlights, I think the interview highlights how this really was a political decision that was made, a political issue. Worth noting, I should make sure that your listeners know that 10 years ago, I was working for Aaron in the Agriculture Minister's office. I didn't work on the Wheat Board files, but Aaron was the chief of staff I reported to at the time. But this clearly was an issue that had been, litigated in coffee shops across the prairies for 30 years. This is something that had been talked about. I think by the time 2011 came around, there probably wasn't much more that could be said or learned on this that hadn't already been said or learned at some point in time. And so what happened was the agriculture minister made a decision, and the podcast episode gets into somehow how that decision played out. It wasn't a unanimous decision. I don't think you were ever going to get to a point where there was broad support for this change, but it was a big change, arguably the most consequential change in farm policy in a generation. And again, somebody needed to effectively just decide or get on with it, and that's what decide and get on with it, and that's what Jerry Ritz did at the time.
And that's one of the cool stories in this episode where Aaron brings up this interview. So Jerry Ritz was, as we know, we've had the chance to chat with Jerry many times over the years. He often speaks off the cuff, and that's kind of what happened following that majority election win in 2011. He was doing a local media interview. I believe it was in Lloydminster. I'm not sure the media outlet, but he basically promised or announced that with the majority, the government was going to roll ahead with ending the wheat board and ending the single desk by August 2012. And Aaron talks about getting calls from the Prime Minister's office after that saying, hang on, what did Ritz promise? We haven't agreed to this. This isn't, what certainly wasn't that high a priority on their list, or Ritz's announcement in that media interview certainly drove it up the list. And so Tyler can maybe speak to that a bit more, but Ritz really forced, that's one of the things we get into, is how Ritz forced the hand of the Harper government and the PMO and cabinet to move on with this, and as Tyler said, make some progress on this issue that had been discussed and debated for a long time in coffee shops across the prairies.
And again, so the platform in 2011 had language in it about respecting the plebiscite, again, which it was just on barley, but respecting the plebiscite and giving farmers marketing freedom. But the language was a little loose. It certainly didn't talk about August 1st, 2012. And so normally what happens after an election, ministers get mandate letters. That is the Prime Minister sending them instructions. The ministers go back to cabinet and say, here's my plan, here's some options, here's the cost, the implications of it. And then once you go through all of that process, then the government makes a decision, an announcement gets made. And Jerry Ritz circumvented a lot of that process by just making the announcement. Now, ministers sometimes do that, and usually what happens is they have to walk it back. If there isn't the support of the Prime Minister, just because and cabinet, just because a minister says something doesn't mean that it's true. I think what was different in this case, and Aaron speaks to it, is that ultimately the Prime Minister and the rest of the cabinet was behind him. So he did make the announcement, and when it did come time then to go back to cabinet with the plan, there was full support, and it was full speed ahead.
Kelvin, what about some of the actual impacts? Because I remember at the time there was so much promises being made on the pro single desk versus the pro freedom marketing, and both had said, if this happens, here's what's going to happen. And in both cases, reality's been, I think, a little bit somewhere in the middle. What did the guests say about that?
Well, both of them so our discussion focused more on the political process side of things, not so much on how the grain industry has changed, I would say, here 10 years later. I do think that you can argue there's still arguments to be made on both sides, and part of that speaks to how deeply entrenched views and opinions are on the wheat board and the monopoly or the single desk. But I think we can look across Western Canada. There has been some significant investment in grain handling capacity and in new elevators and port capacity. Would that have happened if the wheat board was still in place? That's something that I think we can argue, but certainly both sides, I think, or the people who spoke in favor of ending the wheat board, I think would say that investment might not have happened at that point. I do think that in general, we have the crowd that fought to save the wheat board has certainly quieted over the years. Some of them aren't farming anymore. And that's something that David Hurley alluded to or talked about in his demographics. His info showed that older farmers tended to be much more supportive of the single desk concept. And so I do think that over time, views have, I think, in general, people that were opposed have become more okay with it, and people that wanted it to end are still happy that it ended.
Yeah, well, I refer to our study on the 10-year anniversary, and for people that were 65 years and over, 73% said it was better than expected, reflecting on it 10 years later. Tyler, what are your thoughts on what's happened 10 years later and some of the impacts?
One of the things, so as a kind of a farm kid from Eastern Canada, the wheat board was a bit new to me and kind of understanding it when I got involved in federal politics. But it always seemed a little bit odd that somebody that was selling their canola off the farm was making their own marketing decisions when they're growing pulse crops, when they're growing feed barley, wouldn't easily be able to make those same decisions when they start to market wheat. And it turns out taking the monopoly away I think farmers are making those decisions, and it probably hasn't been as drastic. I think one of the things that plays out sometimes in a polarized political debate like this is that, the one side makes it sound so nefarious, makes it sound so terrible that when it doesn't actually end up seeming that bad, actually people think that it's better than it is. And I think that played out. I think people really were talking about almost the demise of growing wheat in Western Canada. And of course, that never really came to be. People started to market wheat the way they market canola, and off they went. And some of those investments that Kelvin talked about happened. And so I think it's probably easy for people to look back and say, hey, people were saying that this was going to be terrible, and it wasn't. And maybe not everybody's convinced that it's a resoundingly good decision, but for most people, it's probably at least no worse than what it was before. And their ability to better manage cash flow and make their own marketing decisions is probably working in their favor. Yeah,
like I think we're just as focused on producing high quality wheat as we were prior to the change. One of the ones that I think hasn't necessarily followed through is that we're going to have all these IP programs. That really hasn't come to fruition.
Yeah, so some of that hasn't taken off. There was, kind of an infamous announcement of a pasta plant that was going to be built in Regina by AGT. That didn't come to pass at the end of the day. This obviously isn't kind of that complete slam dunk. And if you look at kind of wheat acres, certainly wheat acres are under pressure on the prairies, but that probably has a lot more to do with profitability growing canola than it does with any challenges or any changes in wheat marketing. And you always get into this debate over causation versus correlation. I'm not sure how much of the end of the monopoly really caused for these changes, but it certainly correlates with a lot of other changes that have taken place over the last 10 years. And again, changes like bigger farms using new technology, using different management tools, like all of this was going to happen anyways, and probably has just made that transition easier for farmers.
Yeah. Kelvin?
I was just going to say one area where there was a clear impact, and I don't know whether it's more black and white, the impact would be what happened at Churchill. And that's something that we dive into this episode too, because we're realizing now, or I think the federal government is realizing, the Canadian Wheat Board did some heavy lifting in terms of even just national interest, I don't know if security is the right word, but just the strategic interest in maintaining the Port of Churchill as a functioning port. The Canadian Wheat Board actually did a lot of that, whether it should have or not, or whether farmers were subsidizing that or paying the price for that. But that's something that the government is still grappling with today, how to make Churchill viable in the long term, and the importance of Churchill. So that's one area where I think we can say, hey, that was a change affected, or that definitely we can trace back to the end of the Wheat Board. I was also surprised, I can say, after talking to David Hurley, who used to run these producer surveys. He would survey all the permit book holders every year, and I was surprised how dug in he still remains on the polling that happened then, and adamant that farmers supported the Wheat Board, which would be contrary to, or that the majority of farmers supported the Wheat Board, which would be contrary to some of the anecdotal type of research that at least I felt during that time, and what some of the other polling, the Real Agri Studies survey that you've referred to, Shaun, I think would show that that a lot more farmers were okay with it and are happy that it's no longer, the CWB single desk is no longer in effect. I think the numbers skew the opposite direction from what Hurley maintained in this episode. So It's interesting that all these years later, he still stands by how strong support was for the Wheat Board at the time. And that's something that I think when people listen to this episode, it's going to bring back some of those old feelings and some of those old identity. Like, you go back decades, farmers, that was part of your identity if you were a grain farmer in Western Canada, whether you supported the Wheat Board or whether you didn't. There were quite a few people in the middle too that just said, I'll deal with whatever system we have. But for a lot of people, this was, I won't say religion, but it was pretty close to some people's personal identity in terms of whether or not they supported the Wheat Board. Yeah, you're right. I will never forget the marketing campaign. I think it was the board that put out the campaign, which was about the CWBs being steamrolled. And then Ritz had made, I remember being at an event in Calgary where Ritz asked who's steamrolling who.
And then I remember interviewing Wayne Easter, and I remember him saying about how Mr. Ritz is dreaming in Technicolor. I will never forget that. I should pull that audio and play it for everybody, because that was kind of right at the beginning of Real Agriculture. So.
And Shaun, again, I think it just underscores, right, that you were never going to get to a point where everybody was going to agree that this was the right decision, right? Like, no matter what, there was always going to be a very loud, vocal group that said, no, I disagree, this shouldn't happen. And, governments, this government in particular today, really likes to consult and do panels and kind of do these long, ongoing processes to try and get everybody to agree. You could have had, many different panels. You could have many different consultations. You were never going to get agreement on the wheat board. Ultimately, a decision needed to be made if you were going to take the monopoly away. And that's sometimes making the decision is the hard part.
Okay, guys, we're out of time. We could talk about this for a full hour. Maybe we should have. That is a new episode of the Ag Policy Connection podcast presented by CAPI and Real Agriculture. Make sure you go to realagriculture.com to find it, or wherever you get your podcast. Tyler and Kelvin, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we got the top ag news stories of the day. Today's show is brought to you by Pride Seeds.
Warehouse, what can we do for you?
Yeah, I'm looking for some nitrogen.
All right, we're running low and it's awful pricey, but let me check. Hold.
The answer to low supply and high prices for nitrogen is Envita, a microbe with systemic nitrogen fixation. Envita works throughout the foliage and roots, providing a right place, right time source of nitrogen to maximize yield in corn, wheat, and soybeans.
Yeah, we're all out, but...
You know what? I'll take some of that Envita.
That's what I was going to recommend.
Book your Envita while supplies last.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
And welcome back to Real Ag Radio, brought to you today by Pride Seeds. I encourage you to go to prideseed.com. The top ag news stories of the day here on Real Ag Radio is brought to you by Solios. Grow more, risk less, realize greater yield potential, and address the zinc deficiency while improving soil health. Solios Zinc delivers ROI you can count on and is backed with a product guarantee. Try it today. Learn more at Solios. That's SOILEOS.com. Okay, let's get into the top ag news stories here. There's a lot happening. Some economic news to lead off with. The Bank of Canada held its benchmark interest rate steady at 4.5% as expected, keeping monetary policy in a holding pattern with the expectation that inflation will fall quickly in the coming months. The widely anticipated move reinforces the bank's decision last month to pause its rate hike campaign after 8 consecutive increases. Economic growth has been stronger than expected in 2023, challenging the central bank's efforts to slow consumer spending and curb price growth. Now, meanwhile, in the U.S. inflation eased in March to its lowest level in nearly 2 years, but underlying price pressures likely keep the door open for the Federal Reserve to consider another interest rate increase at its May meeting. What's interesting here, okay, is that the Consumer Price Index, a closely watched inflation gauge that measures what consumers pay for goods and services, rose 5% last month from a year earlier, down from the February 6% increase and the smallest gain since May of 21, according to the Labor Department in a story in the Wall Street Journal. Now, 5%. Now, when I first saw that number, I was like, oh, boy, that's a great number, right? Inflation feels like it's curbing. Now, some of the analysis, though, it really kind of puts us in a bit of perspective in the sense that in Pro Farmer, they talked about inflation has been moderating after peaking at about 9% last summer. It remains a long way back to the 2% inflation that was normal before the onset of the pandemic in 2020. Fed officials target 2% inflation, which they would define using a different index, the personal consumption expenditures measure, which uses some data from the consumer price measure, but is calculated differently and released a few weeks later. Bottom line, this is according to Pro Farmer, veteran analysts say the report does not change the dynamics for the Fed. Inflation is still too high, and they think the Fed will boost rates another 25 basis points during the May second, third FOMC meeting. Stay tuned for that. And the effect that if U.S. goes up again, what does the Bank of Canada have to, or do they think about things differently? And what about the Canadian dollar? On Russia and Ukraine, outlook for Black Sea grain deal, not so great. The Kremlin said not all the United Nations efforts to remedy the Black Sea grain deal are working. As a result, the outlook for the deal is not so great, as promises to remove obstacles to Russia's grain and fertilizer exports were not being fulfilled. Canada, of course, one of those countries that has tariffs on and sanctions on the Russian fertilizer. I would be very surprised at this point for Canada to lift those sanctions. Meanwhile, inspections resumed on Wednesday aboard ships operating under the Ukraine Black Sea deal after a one-day halt. Now, this is only a 60-day agreement. We heard Chip Flory say on yesterday's show, this may be the last one. That's kind of what some of the speculation is. Water issues in the western U.S. So planned Colorado River water cuts to preserve dams. The Bureau of Reclamation issued its draft environmental review of possible ways the agency will go about cutting Colorado River water to protect the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams from low reservoir levels. The draft review, which will soon be made available for public comment, is expected to be finalized later this summer. The Bureau said it will use the final review to inform decisions that it plans to make in August about how it will operate the dams in 2024. Still, the agency is hoping states will come to an agreement, but water cuts so the Interior Department won't have to act. Deputy Interior Secretary Tommy Boudreau said on Tuesday. Argentina crops take it on the chin, so soybean production in Argentina will fall to a 23-year low and corn production to a 5-year low as a crop-wasting drought decimated fields in the key South American producer. The U.S. government said on Tuesday that Argentina's soybean harvest was pegged at 27 million tons and the corn crop at 37 million tons, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Southern Minnesota pork plant likely to close, laying off 1,000 people. So pork processing plants in southern Minnesota is poised to shut down and permanently lay off about 1,000 people if a new owner for the Wyndham operation can't be found soon. This is according to the Star Tribune. The move reflects challenging economic conditions for portions of the pork industry. High Life Foods filed notice with the state this week that its efforts to turn the business around have been unsuccessful. In 2020, Canadian-based High Life bought 75% ownership of the plant from Taylor Corp, which is based in Mankato. So plant closing, 1,000 jobs, big deal. 1,000 jobs is a lot of jobs. It is a lot of jobs. Speaking of a lot of jobs, I saw that Tesla now not Tesla, Twitter, same owner, different company. Twitter's down to like 1,500 employees. It was at 8,000 at the peak. They think that now Twitter may be actually cash flow positive quite soon because of a lot of these cuts. Either the operations changed or the bloating to have 8,000 employees and go to 1,500 and the thing still operates. What were people doing? Also, is there a long-term impact? Like, you know, we're a big part of those people in like the innovation side of the equation. I don't know. Could you cut yourself? Like, that's like going from like 9 employees to 2. Like within a very short period of time. I'm not sure how many companies could do that. So I'm interested to know some of the internal dynamics of that. If you have any feedback on today's show, we'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also call the RealAg feedback line, of course, 855-776-6147. I want to thank everybody for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Radio. And a big shout out as well to Pride Seeds for being today's show sponsor. Don't forget to go to prideseed.com. Everybody have yourselves a great day, and we'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you for downloading this episode of RealAg Radio, brought to you by high-performing new carbine insecticide from FMC. New carbine insecticide hits aphids hard with effective, selective, and extended control. It also has activity on ligus and tarnished plant bugs. Ask your retailer today.